Well, good morning again. I'm going to say something that I want you to think about in just a second, but let's first pray. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Amen. Now here's what I want you to think about. God's call upon our lives has an interesting reciprocal nature to it. Let me say that again. God's call upon our lives has a reciprocal nature to it. Let me tell you what I mean by that. As with God's grace, which always comes first before any response on our part, before we know to love God back, before we're able to love God back, before we return in any way that love that God sheds upon us, just like God's grace, God's call precedes our response of faith when we commit to serving the Lord. Now, when I talk about serving the Lord, when we talk about service, I'm not talking about just being a pastor. I'm talking about all of us, lay as well as clergy. When we serve the Lord, when we commit to Christ, when we promise, we vow, when we turn to God in some new or special way, we do so first because God has already called us in that moment. It's reciprocal. The idea doesn't start with us. I believe that it always follows some movement or some action on the part of God first toward us. Take, for example, today's gospel lesson that we just heard read by Pastor Brandon from Matthew 14. What is it that starts this story? Did the disciples decide to hop in the boat and take a pleasure cruise across the Sea of Galilee one day? No, not at all. In fact, what happened was after Jesus had finished performing this amazing miracle that he had performed in terms of the fishes and the loaves, feeding the 5,000 men and the women and children, after he had done that, then Matthew says, immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side of the lake, while he dismissed the crowds, and then he went up to a mountainside to pray. Jesus directed their actions and he sent them across the lake. In other words, he put them in the position to experience everything that would follow thereafter out on that lake. Now, I keep referring to this as a lake, and we call it the Sea of Galilee. It is a very large lake by our standards. The Sea of Galilee was 13 miles long and about 8 miles wide at its widest. By the way, Lake Norman is, I think, 33.5 miles long and 9 miles wide at its widest. So actually, Lake Norman is larger than the Sea of Galilee. But here's the thing, even though the Sea of Galilee is of a moderate size, it has this interesting thing that happens because of the configuration of the mountains around it. When I visited the Holy Land a number of years ago, I learned that because of the arrangement of those mountains, when storms will come along, they kind of funnel the wind down onto the lake, and it really kicks up the wind really fast because of that. The seaboat captain that I got to meet when I was there, he told about the fact that a lot of times he's experienced in those storms waves as high as 10 feet. Now, try to imagine if you're in a really small boat, which the disciples were in this story, how much impact 10-foot waves might have on you if you're out in the middle of that lake. So Jesus told the disciples to go across the lake in a boat. Now, it wasn't the first time that Jesus took the initiative. As Will Willimon points out, Jesus didn't usually wait for people to come to him. He usually went looking for them. And after he began preaching, Jesus, on the very same shores of this Sea of Galilee, called disciples to him. He came across two pairs of brothers who were out there fishing. He didn't wait for them just to come over to him. He called them and asked them to follow him. He also came across Matthew, the tax collector, perhaps the author of this very book, and he asked him to leave what he was doing and to follow him. These men didn't go looking for Jesus. Jesus came and found them first. And then Jesus did an interesting thing. He found them, and then he would send them out into the world. while they were still in training even as disciples, as students, in other words, they were sent out, and that's what made them apostles. That's the meaning behind that word, somebody who is sent out. They became apostles because Jesus called them and sent them out into the world. He sent them out to the lost sheep of Israel, and he sent them out to preach that the kingdom of heaven was near, and he sent them out to heal the sick and to raise the dead and to drive out demons. That's high order, especially for new followers of Jesus. When Jesus comes looking for you, beware, because he's not likely calling you to a life of leisure. In fact, he's probably calling to stretch you beyond where you've been before, to get you to do something you've never imagined doing for yourself before, or going somewhere where you've never gone before. There's a story about a man who's standing at the pearly gates. Have you ever done anything of particular merit? St. Peter asks him. The man says, well, I can think of one thing. Once I came upon a gang of really tough bikers who were threatening this young woman. And I told them to leave her alone, but they wouldn't listen. So I approached the largest and most heavily tattooed biker, and I smacked him on the head, and I kicked his bike over, and I ripped out his nose ring, and I threw it to the ground, and I said, leave her alone, or you'll have to deal with me. St. Peter was impressed and asked him, well, when did this happen? A couple of minutes ago. Now, Jesus is not likely calling us to make that level of sacrifice, but he does call us to expand our horizons, to stretch ourselves in service to the kingdom. But first, it seems to be important that he gets our attention. Why would that be? Well, because we can't hear him otherwise. We can't hear his calling unless he first gets our attention. That's what happened in today's gospel lesson. Jesus sends the disciples, as I said, across the lake at night. Terrible storm comes in, and it's battering the boat with wind and waves. And these disciples are basically stranded in the middle of the Sea of Galilee. And then they must have been exhausted and at their wits' end, pulling those oars hopelessly, going nowhere fast into the headwind of the storm. Somewhere between 3 and 6 a.m., and we know that because it's the fourth watch according to the original Greek, and that's a Roman measurement of time, those 3 hours of the night. Between 3 and 6, suddenly Jesus appears, walking on the water. Now, they don't know what to make of this, and you can't hardly blame them. I mean, they think it's a ghost, and they cry out in fear. Now, I've read some biblical commentators, and they kind of talk about all the meaning behind this, and they say, back then there was this traditional belief that the waters of the world represented chaos or evil, and that maybe the disciples saw the roiling waters as a battle between heaven and the forces of evil, and that's why they were terrified. That may be true, but I've got a simpler explanation for it. I mean, they were in the middle of this lake. The waves were kicking up enormously high. They were fearful of their boat capsizing, and then they thought they saw a ghost. Who wouldn't be afraid under those circumstances? Now, realizing their fear, Jesus identifies himself, and he says, do not be afraid. Easier said than done. And Peter, who's true to form, he speaks up, and he says, Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water. Now, a number of people have pointed this out in things I've read. That's a really weird thing to say if you think about it. I mean, in the midst of all of this, Peter says, tell me to come out into the water? What we really would have expected him to say is, Lord, if it's you, would you please stop this storm? Remember, it already happened in the Gospel of Matthew earlier. They were all together in the boat. You'd think much more likely that Peter would have said, please, Lord, stop the storm, stop the wind, and by the way, get on in the boat with us. But he doesn't. Michael Turner makes an interesting suggestion, which caught my eye. He says, Peter's request may have come out of his desire to be a good disciple. You see, now, what disciples would do with their teachers, with their rabbis, is they would listen to everything they would say. They would soak it all up. And so what they would try to do is they would do everything that their disciple would, their their rabbi, their teacher, would do. They would try to say what their teacher said, and they would try to be just like their teacher in every way. So his theory is that Peter was trying to be an A-plus disciple. And so there was Jesus walking on the water, so he was going to try to do the same thing. But here's the thing, and to Peter's credit, Peter understands this is a pretty outrageous thing. He can't just say, okay, I think I'll walk on the water. He understands that only by God's power revealed in Jesus, can he do this outrageous thing. And so he says to Jesus, command me to come out to the water. See, if Jesus commands it, if Jesus says it, it's like God in the creation of the world. It comes to pass. He has that kind of faith in Jesus. Command me to come out onto the water. And so Jesus does. Jesus complies with him and says, come out. And Peter does. I just can't imagine what was going on in the minds of the other disciples at this point, watching him as he's crawling over the edge of the boat. But there Peter goes, and he starts walking on top of the water, on top of the waves, all of this going on. He's walking right toward Jesus. And all is going well until what happens? He takes his eye off Jesus. He takes his eye off Jesus, and he starts looking around him, and he says, oh my gosh, look at the waves, look at the wind. It doesn't say it in the scriptures, but maybe he also looked down and said, oh my gosh, I'm on top of water. He takes his eye off Jesus, and he starts to sink. But Jesus never takes his eye off of Peter. And he reaches out and he grabs him and he pulls him up and he helps him into the boat, and the both of them get into the boat together. And suddenly the storm subsides and the waves calm down and the wind goes away. As I said earlier, God gets our attention before we respond to God's calling. Jesus walking on the water caught the eye of the disciples, especially Peter, who was suddenly inspired to take this bold step, this giant leap, if you will, of getting out of the boat. Something grabbed Peter inside and unlocked faith enough to take that big step, drawing him out of the boat and closer to Jesus, physically and spiritually. Yes, he had doubts. Yes, he got scared when he focused on the wind instead of Jesus and started to sink. But Peter got out of the boat, unlike all those other disciples who were there with him. And I think that's the key thing that we ought to focus on this morning. Peter got out of the boat. This weekend, as I said at the outset, marks the 40th anniversary of when someone else in our time and in this church got out of the boat, another boat that is. Something happened to Bill White 40 years ago, leading him to stretch himself, as I said, to do what I'm sure he never imagined himself doing, and to go where I'm confident he never dreamed of going, and that is Haiti. Bill was a successful businessman and a member of our church back in 1980, along with his wife Alice. They also owned a horse farm here in South Charlotte, and Bill owned a 50-foot sailboat with twin diesel engines that was named the Pieces of Eight. It was moored up in Virginia Beach, Virginia. And Bill and his family enjoyed fishing on that boat, sailing, and excursions for 10 years. But then on Christmas Eve, 1979, Bill stunned his family when he announced that he was getting out of the boat. Those are my words, not his. He announced that he was giving the boat to the United Methodist Church. Now, without realizing it at the time, Bill was kicking off the Haiti mission of this church that's been going on for 4 decades and counting. But he didn't realize it at the time. A series of events followed that resulted in the boat and this church being directed to Haiti and its people, which the Reverend Harley Dixon, senior pastor of this church at the time, has chronicled in such wonderful detail in the book, The Real Miracle. Similar to the disciples being told by Jesus to go to the other side of the lake, Bill was soon asked by the executive director of UMCOR, that's the United Methodist Committee on Relief, to deliver the Pieces of Eight to Port-au-Prince, Haiti. It's funny, at the time, Bill remarked, where is that? He didn't even have any idea where Port-au-Prince was. But he agreed to make this 1,600-mile journey from Virginia Beach to Haiti even though it wasn't the safest of things to do under any circumstance, but especially back in August of 1980 when this would take place. You see, at that particular time, that's hurricane season. And there were a number of hurricanes that were tracking across the Atlantic to the Caribbean. In addition, at that time, there was a real big problem with pirates, drug-running pirates, who would come upon any solo boat and basically take it over and potentially kill the person or persons on board. And on top of that, he'd had to swing by Cuba, which exactly wasn't our best friend, certainly at the time or even now. Now, thankfully, Bill fared a lot better than the fellow did in my story about the bikers and the guy who found his way before St. Peter. Harley's book captures this excerpt from the ship's log along with a supplemental note by Alice. Listen to what it says. On August the 8th, 1980, a boat called the Pieces of Eight sailed out into the Atlantic, and unbeknownst to anyone then, she launched a mission as well. Congratulations, because we're now in day one of the 5th decade of the mission to Haiti. Bill White didn't realize it at the time, as I noted, although the ship's captain's log would later reflect that when he first sighted land off the coast of Haiti, he remarked, "There's something about Haiti. There's something there." In late December 1980, Alice White made her first trip to Haiti by plane. She, like her husband, was quickly and deeply moved by this country and its beautiful and resilient people. Hunger and poor health were two predominant challenges the people of Haiti were facing, however. It's, I believe, the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. As to the former, hunger, the idea arose of using the Pieces of Eight as a fishing boat by Haitians. The idea was that if they could learn to fish for themselves, they could be more self-sufficient as far as feeding themselves. But this plan ultimately didn't work, and they decided instead to sell the boat and use the proceeds in a different way. Proceeds were used for a clinic in Haiti, and that helped address the second challenge about poor health. Something else happened, though, that's really, really important to the story of this church and connecting to that health clinic. Other persons got out of the boat, so to speak. You see, in Providence United Methodist Church, there was already a hunger for missions. In fact, from what I understand, that's been in our DNA from our founding. That's who we are as a church. We are a missional church. We don't just say that, we are that. And we have been from the start. And so at this particular time, what happened was afterward, eventually, Bill White started talking to some folks here at church, and it came before the mission committee that was chaired at the time by Al Rose, and there had been a special Christmas Eve offering, and there were some funds that were left over, and so the mission committee decided to use some of those funds for Haiti. Well, we were hooked, no pun intended then. That December, a group of 11 church members were flying down to Haiti for what's now referred to as the Look-See Mission. The Look-See Mission. They looked, they saw, and the rest is history. Those members of our church had gotten out of the boat, and since then, many, 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 many other people have also gotten out of the boat and gone to Haiti, physically or with their hearts. One of the people who was on that mission, who's been a longtime member of our church, is Carolyn Boylan. I talked to her the other day, and she and her husband were very committed to that ministry. Funny thing is, it started in a funny way, she told me. Their connection, no pun intended, well, there was a pun intended to that, I'm sorry. Their connection was a pair of jumper cables. See, they were new to Providence at the time, and they heard about this new mission maybe to Haiti and how they had some needs for this boat. This is when they were trying to use the boat. And among the needs were some heavy-duty jumper cables. So Howard, he'd gotten to the car, went down to Sears, and he purchased the jumper cables, brought them over to the church, and somebody here at the church says, well, you need to get them to Bill and Alice White. And so he was directed to their farm, their horse farm in South Charlotte. So he went out there and he got to know Bill and Alice, and Bill and Alice helped him get to know Haiti and started talking about all that was going on. Well, he got hooked, and then Carolyn also got charged with the idea. She told me, you never know what the Lord will use you for. You never know how the Lord will use you. How true indeed. Al and Helen Rose are two other members of our church who went on that look-see mission. Funny story about Helen is that she got terribly sick. I mean, really sick. I talked to her and she said it was like, just like that, all of a sudden, terrible nausea. She didn't know what it was that was coming over her, but she felt like she was going to die. And the group that particular day was trying to paint the interior of a clinic. And so they put Helen on a table, an examining table, and they were trying to paint in the room, so they didn't want to splatter paint on her, so they put a sheet over her. She kind of looked like she was dead. She felt like she was dead. She's laughing about it now, thankfully, and she got well real quickly. In Harley Dixon's book, her husband Al is quoted regarding the struggle of sharing the good news of Jesus Christ with persons who are hungry and hurting. And he talks about how difficult it is to talk about the good news of Jesus when those things are going on in somebody's life, that you have to address those needs first before the message of hope will have a chance. Al talked to me about the joy of being part of this mission to Haiti. He said no one's seeking any medals. They just felt led by God to do what they should do. Did you hear that? They felt led by God to do what they were supposed to do. You remember what I said at the outset about God taking the initiative through Jesus? Jesus doesn't just wait on us. He comes to us and he calls us to him. And then, as I said earlier, he tells us to get out of the boat. You know, I was curious about the name of the boat, Pieces of 8. So I decided to look that up yesterday, what that really meant. What could have been behind that? Bill and Alice are no longer with us, so we can't ask them. Well, you may know this, but Pieces of 8 were Spanish silver coins that were common in the American colonies before the colonies had their own monetary systems or were allowed to issue their own currency. And to make change, it's interesting, what they would do is they would cut up these coins in 8 pieces like a pie. It looked like a pie, cutting it that way. And so if you need to make change, you just gave a piece of the 8. By the way, that's also where the nickname for the American quarter came from. You've ever heard it called 2 bits? Well, it's 2 bits. It's 2 of these bits right here. 2 bits are pieces of the coin, which would be 1/4 or 1/4 of the whole coin. Anyway, I got to thinking about the boat, the Pieces of 8, and how it was subdivided, in a sense, into many other missions, all arising from the original. The boat was sold, and its proceeds led our church to fund and build the Tovar Clinic, which continues to this day as the longest-running medical mission in the United Methodist Church. And all kinds of people from this congregation and from other congregations all around us who were inspired by this, doctors and nurses, went down to Haiti and participated in this mission, giving of their time and their talents toward the health of the people of Haiti. Wells became a major focus of the ministry of this church. And wells are so important. The water in third world countries is so unsafe. Cholera is a real big problem. And so we, from early on, have been digging wells, safe wells in Haiti. And by last count, unless I'm mistaken, I believe this church alone has dug 42 wells, giving clean and safe drinking water to the people of Haiti. And with partners, with other people who we've worked with, we're well over 100. Now think about that. How many lives are being saved by that action continually? We've supported education in the Cap Haitian area through a school as well as scholarship help. We helped a young woman, Tashaleen, if I'm pronouncing her name correctly, from Don Don, to go to nursing school. Now think about that investment, how that's going to be saving lives countlessly going forward. Think about the power of that investment. We also make sure that much needed medical supplies are being sent from the U.S. to Haiti through our financial support of the Haiti Mission Foundation in Charlottesville, Virginia. This is a nonprofit that was formed out of our ministry. It grew out of this church's Haiti mission. And more recently, we've been encouraging and supporting Dr. Eugene. In fact, for years we have, in many, many ways, including helping in the construction of New Hope Hospital in Plain du Nord, outside of Cap Haitian, where he's the medical director. Many folks don't know that his very life was saved by the actions of some within this congregation. Again, think of the long-term impact of those efforts on countless persons in the years ahead. And one of the most growth-producing pieces of aid is our microcredit loan program to women in northern Haiti. The women who are participating in this loan program, last year I think there were 388 active microloans, have an incredibly high rate of repayment. And here's the interesting thing, they tend to use their earnings for the benefit of their families, which means lots of other people are being benefited by it. I hate to say this, but we men tend not to do as well under these circumstances. And so that's why we focused on women as far as microloans. They've got small businesses, real small businesses like selling chickens to people, that sort of thing. But it's enough to produce income for their families and to help their kids go to school. An amazing impact that's taking place because of that. You know, it really is remarkable when you think about the 40-year mission of this church to Haiti and the number of lives that have been saved and changed and otherwise touched by the members of this congregation, and most importantly, by the love of Christ through them. Harley Dixon, at the end of his book, tells what the real miracle is that led him to give it that title. He writes, "The real miracle is a love that compels volunteers to share their love with brothers and sisters in Haiti, people often forgotten, sometimes undeserving, who don't always appreciate what is done in their behalf, but who are loved anyway. The real miracle is not in numbers healed or in missions accomplished. It is in the faithfulness of those who share their love in Haiti, for better or worse, in success or failure, taking on the form of a servant and helping in a practical way." Peter, along with the other disciples called by Jesus, wasn't gifted with some specialized skills that made him an expert apostle. In fact, he seemed to have some personality quirks and weaknesses that you could say made him less qualified. But he did have one very important quality that made him an apostle and made him the rock. And that was faith to get out of the boat. As we close this message, let me encourage you to think about this. All of the members of this church who have given of their time and their talent and their treasure, beginning with Bill and Alice White in support of the Haiti mission, have shown a similar faith and willingness to get out of the boat. Here's the remarkable thing. It's not just because we're super special people. It's not because Peter was super special. It's because something happened within his heart. Something happened within the hearts and minds of the people of this congregation to move themselves in a way they never could have imagined before, and they got out of the boat. And it's that same faith that all of us can have and can show that will sail this ministry forward to Haiti into its 5th decade, and God willing, far beyond. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.